I have been a die-hard Bitcoin fan since 2017. So obsessed that I once convinced family members to take out loans just to buy it. For 9 years, whenever anyone called Bitcoin a bubble, a form of gambling, or a scam, I dismissed every single word and fired back counter-arguments without missing a beat. But as time went on, the more I observed and reflected on what was truly happening in this industry, the more I began to notice a lot of things that did not add up. The criticisms I had once brushed off were accumulating clearer and clearer evidence. I pulled it all together and distilled it into 5 charges. Charges that paint a picture completely different from everything I had believed for so many years. A picture in which Bitcoin looks less like a financial revolution and more like a sophisticated global scale scheme. To examine this picture carefully, I want to invite everyone to take on the role of a jury in a trial. The defendant, Bitcoin. The charge, sophisticated scheme on a global scale. In this trial, I will play the role of defense attorney, pushing back against the charges brought by the prosecution. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I invite you to follow along. First, the prosecution may present its case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I would like to begin with the most basic charge. Charge 1. Bitcoin cannot function as currency. Prosecution. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I would like to begin with the most fundamental charge. What was Bitcoin created to do? Right here, the white paper written by Satoshi Nakamoto in 2008. Please direct your attention to the very first line of the title, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Cash, not gold, not a speculative asset, not a store of value. Its creator stated it plainly. Bitcoin is money. So after 16 years, how well has Bitcoin fulfilled its role as money? I submit 3 pieces of evidence. Evidence 1. Speed. The Bitcoin network processes approximately 500,000 transactions per day. That sounds like a lot. But how many does Visa process? 65,000 transactions per second, meaning everything the entire Bitcoin network handles in a full day, Visa processes in under 8 seconds. The so-called currency of the future is thousands of times slower than a basic bank card in use today. Evidence 2. Cost and energy. A single Bitcoin transaction consumes as much electricity as an American household uses over 43 days. 43 days, ladies and gentlemen, to do what? To transfer an amount of money that a simple card tap could handle instantly. And the fees? At times, Bitcoin network fees have surged to tens of dollars per transaction. Imagine ordering a $3 cup of coffee and paying $25 in fees to process it. Can something like that really be called money? Evidence 3. Real-world acceptance. There are approximately 350 million businesses worldwide. How many actually accept Bitcoin? Around 18,000. That is a rate of under 0.006%. Effectively nothing. And even within that 18,000, most do not truly accept Bitcoin. The majority use payment gateways that convert Bitcoin into dollars within seconds the moment a customer pays. In other words, Bitcoin only passes through the transaction like a visitor passing through town. It never stays to do the job of money. Ladies and gentlemen, 16 years. Bitcoin cannot buy a cup of coffee, cannot pay a utility bill, cannot purchase anything in daily life with any ease. The peer-to-peer electronic cash mission that Satoshi wrote in the white paper, consider it bankrupt. The prosecution rests. Defense. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not dispute the figures the prosecution just presented, but I ask you to consider 3 points for the sake of a fair assessment. First, Bitcoin never promised to replace Visa in terms of speed. Layer 1 of Bitcoin was deliberately designed to be slow in order to ensure security and decentralization. For speed, there are Layer 2 solutions, the most prominent being the Lightning Network. Through Lightning, Bitcoin transfers are nearly instant and fees are nearly zero. Against Lightning, Visa holds no advantage. Second, on energy. Yes, Bitcoin consumes electricity. But the global banking system, with its millions of branches, billions of computers, and tens of millions of employees commuting to work every day, also consumes an enormous amount. No one calculates that figure. People only cite Bitcoin's energy use as a scare tactic. Third, on the matter of 18,000 businesses being a small number, every technology takes time. How many people were using the internet in 1994? How many stores accepted credit cards in the 1950s? It is unreasonable to demand that a 16-year-old technology achieve the same level of adoption as systems that have been running for hundreds of years. The defense rests. Prosecution responds. Ladies and gentlemen, the defense made compelling arguments, but listen carefully. All 3 points have problems. The Lightning Network launched in 2018, that is 8 years ago. By the end of 2023, the total capacity of the entire Lightning Network reached approximately 5,000 Bitcoin, an extremely modest figure, and to this day, no one is actually using Lightning to buy a coffee at a shop down the street. The technology exists, but the users do not. That is a deployment failure, not a success waiting to be realized. Comparing energy to banks? Yes, banks use electricity, but banks serve billions of people with hundreds of billions of transactions per year, covering loans, deposits, insurance, and international transfers. Bitcoin consumes comparable energy, but does exactly one thing: moving value from one wallet to another. That comparison does not help the defense. As for every technology takes time, the internet had hundreds of millions of daily users within 10 years. Bitcoin, 16 years in, has a number of people actually using it as money on a daily basis that you could count on your fingers. 16 years is long enough to draw conclusions. Time is no longer an excuse. The prosecution rests. Defense responds. Ladies and gentlemen, rather than argue each point individually, I want you to step back and look at the root issue. What is the prosecution doing? They are taking Visa's numbers, business adoption numbers, Lightning user numbers, and concluding Bitcoin has failed. But where do those numbers come from? They come from a world in which Bitcoin exists like an abandoned child. No government recognizes it as legal tender. No central bank supports it. No national infrastructure serves it. No educational system teaches people how to use it. Under those conditions, the fact that Bitcoin has not achieved wide adoption is entirely expected. But that does not prove Bitcoin cannot serve as money. It only proves that Bitcoin has never been given the chance to do so. Visa did not get where it is today on its own. Visa had an entire banking system behind it, legal protections in place, government backing. The internet did not explode on its own. The US government pumped tens of billions of dollars into building digital infrastructure, enacted e-commerce legislation, and pushed digital literacy nationwide. Every world-changing technology has had that kind of foundation beneath it. What about Bitcoin? Nothing at all. It is swimming alone in the middle of the ocean. The whole world is demanding that Bitcoin prove itself as money. While not a single nation is willing to treat it as money, that is not a fair trial. That is throwing an athlete into a pool with their hands and feet bound, then criticizing them for not knowing how to swim. Give Bitcoin a real opportunity, the foundation every world-changing technology has received. Then pass judgment. Until then, every conclusion the prosecution draws is a premature verdict in a rigged competition. The defense rests. Prosecution. Ladies and gentlemen, I must thank the defense. The defense has just called for Bitcoin to be given a real opportunity, the foundation that every world-changing technology has received. Excellent, because that is precisely the evidence I intend to present next. Because, ladies and gentlemen, there is a country that gave Bitcoin exactly the foundation the defense just described. A country that recognized Bitcoin as legal tender, passed laws requiring every business to accept it, built a dedicated digital wallet for its entire population, and gave away money for citizens to download and start using it. It gave Bitcoin exactly the opportunity the defense just requested, and what was the result of this experiment? That brings us to the second charge. Charge 2. Bitcoin failed its national scale experiment. Prosecution, ladies and gentlemen, in September 2021, El Salvador did something no country in the world had ever dared to do. They recognized Bitcoin as legal tender, alongside the US dollar. Official, legislated, in full effect. This was not a half-hearted trial. The government of El Salvador went further than anyone could have imagined. First, they passed a law requiring every business in the country to accept Bitcoin as payment, not a recommendation, a mandate. Second, they built a dedicated digital wallet called Chivo, issued free to the entire population, integrating both Bitcoin and dollars. Third, they gave every citizen who registered for Chivo $30 in Bitcoin, seed money to get people started. With El Salvador's average income level, $30 is a meaningful amount. Fourth, President Nayib Bukele personally promoted Bitcoin on social media every day, used public funds to purchase Bitcoin, and turned the country into a global standard bearer for the Bitcoin movement. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the golden opportunity the defense just asked for. An entire nation standing as guarantor. An entire government investing in infrastructure. An entire legal framework clearing the path. An entire population given money to try it out. If Bitcoin could truly serve as money, this was its moment to shine. Please review the results. Evidence 1. Remittances. Remittances account for 1/4 of El Salvador's GDP. Workers in the United States send money home through Western Union at high cost. Bitcoin should have been the dream solution. But, according to the IMF, less than 2% of remittances moved through Bitcoin. 98% of the population continued to choose the old system, the very system Bitcoin was designed to replace. Evidence 2, the Chivo wallet, millions downloaded it. But, according to a survey by the National Bureau of Economic Research, 60% of those who downloaded it did so only to collect the $30 and never opened it again. Evidence 3, public trust. 66% of El Salvador's population considers Bitcoin a failed project. 77% want the government to stop using public funds to support it. And in early 2025, under pressure from the IMF, while negotiating a $1.4 billion loan, Bukele quietly backed down. The requirement for businesses to accept Bitcoin was removed. Chivo was scaled back. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not an experiment cut short. This was an experiment that ran long enough, had sufficient resources, and failed so publicly that the very government conducting it had to quietly retreat. The prosecution rests. Defense. Ladies and gentlemen, El Salvador is a small country, 6 million people with a per capita GDP less than 1/10 of the United States. Many of its citizens have never had a bank account. They were not yet familiar with even the most basic financial services. How could they be expected to grasp digital wallets, private keys, and digital asset management? Introducing complex technology to a population that is not yet ready, then declaring the technology a failure, is like putting someone who has never driven before behind the wheel of a Formula One race car, and then concluding that race cars are useless. Give Bitcoin more time, with conditions better suited to it. The defense rests. Prosecution responds. Ladies and gentlemen, the defense says El Salvador's population was not sufficiently prepared, so the experiment was not a fair test. But may I ask, what was Bitcoin's founding promise? Money for everyone, no banks required, no borders. Bitcoin was marketed specifically as the solution for developing nations for people without bank accounts. El Salvador was Bitcoin's ideal target audience. Now the defense is saying El Salvador's population was not capable enough to use Bitcoin? Then who exactly is Bitcoin for? The prosecution rests. Defense responds. Ladies and gentlemen, a failed experiment does not mean the idea behind it is fraudulent. The internet was once predicted by Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman to have no greater impact than the fax machine. Bitcoin may not have succeeded in its role as currency, but that does not mean it has no value. It remains digital gold, a store of value in an era when fiat currency loses purchasing power. The defense rests. Prosecution. The defense just said, Bitcoin is digital gold, a store of value. Very good, because that is precisely the third charge I wish to present. This title of digital gold, when put to the test with actual data, has significant problems of its own. Charge 3. Bitcoin is not digital gold and not a store of value. Prosecution. Ladies and gentlemen, the defense just called Bitcoin digital gold, a very impressive label. But to deserve that label, Bitcoin must do exactly what gold has done for thousands of years, hold its value stably over time. People store gold because they know that next year, a decade from now, its value will remain roughly the same. What about Bitcoin? Evidence 1. Volatility. According to market data, Bitcoin's annual volatility is approximately 60%. For US equities, it is about 15%. For gold, about 12%. That means Bitcoin is 4 times more volatile than stocks and 5 times more volatile than gold. An asset that can drop 20% in a single month, and that is called a store of value? The contradiction is evident just from saying it out loud. Evidence 2. Historical price collapses. In just the past 5 years alone, Bitcoin has dropped more than 50% at least 3 times. In 2022, Bitcoin lost nearly 75% of its value in just a few months. Ask yourselves, if you placed your life savings into an asset that could evaporate 75% in a matter of months, would that be storing value or gambling? Evidence 3. Actual investor behavior. Professional asset managers, the people who oversee trillions of dollars, how much do they recommend allocating to Bitcoin? 1 to 2%. That is not the allocation of a safe asset. That is the allocation of a high-risk speculative position meant to be kept very small. And Warren Buffett, widely considered the greatest living investor, called Bitcoin rat poison squared. Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, the largest bank in America, called it a pet rock. These individuals manage trillions of dollars in assets. They do not speak carelessly. Ladies and gentlemen, calling an asset with 60% annual volatility capable of losing 3/4 of its value in a few months a store of value. That is not a description. That is marketing. The prosecution rests. Defense. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution is using short-term volatility to judge a long-term asset. That is the wrong angle. Look at the bigger picture. In 2013, Bitcoin's price was around $100. Today, it is approaching $100,000. Anyone who bought Bitcoin 10 years ago and held until now has come out ahead. Is there another asset in history that has delivered that kind of growth? Very few. As for high volatility, that is a characteristic of every asset in its phase of maturation. Amazon's stock dropped 90% in its early years. Apple came close to bankruptcy. If you judge every growth asset by its short-term volatility, none would survive the scrutiny. And Bitcoin's volatility has been declining across successive cycles. The 2013 cycle was far more volatile than 2017. The 2017 cycle more volatile than 2021. And 2021 more volatile than now. The trend is clear. Bitcoin is maturing. As for Warren Buffett and Jamie Dimon, they are products of the old financial system. Of course, they criticize Bitcoin. That is a conflict of interest, not objective analysis. The defense rests. Prosecution responds, ladies and gentlemen, the defense says anyone who bought in 2013 and held until now has won. True. But the critical question is, how many people actually managed to do that? According to multiple surveys from major exchanges, the majority of individual Bitcoin investors end up losing money. They buy at the top, sell at the bottom, cannot endure the volatility, and give up midway. Anyone who held for 10 years won is true in theory and false in practice, because very few people can hold through a 75% drawdown. As for comparing Bitcoin to Amazon and Apple sell real products, generate real profit, pay real dividends. Shareholders hold a stake in a business that is actively generating earnings. Bitcoin produces no cash flow, has no revenue, has nothing standing behind it except belief. That comparison does not hold, and on Buffett and Dimon having conflicts of interest, Buffett has invested in BYD, in battery technology, in industries that threaten the oil and gas holdings he carries. He does not shy away from investing in things that go against his old interests when he believes in them. He does not believe in Bitcoin. That is an investment judgment, not self-protection. The prosecution rests. Defense responds, ladies and gentlemen, I acknowledge that Bitcoin is highly volatile. I acknowledge that many people have lost money because they could not endure the swings. But none of that proves Bitcoin is a fraud. It only proves Bitcoin is a high-risk asset. High risk is not the same as fraud. If high risk were fraud, then early-stage technology stocks would be fraud. Startups would be fraud. Real estate in emerging markets would be fraud. Bitcoin is simply an asset with an exceptionally high-risk profile. Those who understand and accept that risk may participate. Those who cannot should stand aside. That is a personal choice, not evidence of fraud. The defense rests. Prosecution. Ladies and gentlemen, high risk is not fraud, I agree. But every legitimate high-risk asset has a foundation. Technology stocks have revenue, users, products. Startups have teams and business models. Real estate has land and location. What does Bitcoin have standing behind it? If not money, not digital gold. What is keeping Bitcoin's price at tens of thousands of dollars? And that is exactly the fourth charge I wish to present. Charge 4. Bitcoin is not as decentralized as promised. Prosecution. Ladies and gentlemen, Bitcoin has been marketed on a very grand promise. Decentralization, money for everyone, no one in control, no whales able to manipulate it. Each person holds a share, power distributed equally. That was the promise. What is the reality? Evidence 1. Ownership distribution. According to on-chain data analyzed by multiple sources, approximately 2% of addresses currently hold 95% of the total Bitcoin supply. Let me repeat that. 2% of addresses hold 95%, the remaining 98% of addresses share exactly 5% among themselves. This level of ownership concentration is many times higher than in the stock market, and even higher than the wealth inequality found in most countries in the world. Call this decentralized? Evidence 2. The Jane Street case. Jane Street is a major financial trading firm on Wall Street. They have recently been sued on allegations that they were among the actors who triggered the crypto market collapse of 2022, wiping out approximately $40 billion in market value, not a country, not a central bank. Just one trading firm on Wall Street. One firm that, if Bitcoin were truly decentralized, could never have had that kind of impact. Evidence 3. Large institutions dominating the flow. Since Bitcoin ETFs were approved in the United States, BlackRock, Fidelity, and a small group of institutions have been accumulating hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin. Add MicroStrategy, add major exchanges like Binance and Coinbase holding Bitcoin on behalf of millions of users. The majority of Bitcoin flow in today's market is passing through exactly the kind of players Bitcoin claimed it would replace: Wall Street and large financial corporations. Ladies and gentlemen, the decentralization story, it turns out, is only true at the technological layer. In terms of ownership, in terms of money flows, in terms of price influence, Bitcoin has centralized in exactly the way it once promised it never would. The foundational promise has been broken. The prosecution rests. Defense. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution is confusing two very different concepts: ownership concentration and concentration of control over the network. Yes, 2% of addresses hold 95% of Bitcoin, but that figure includes exchange addresses holding Bitcoin on behalf of millions of users. A single Binance address may represent hundreds of thousands of individual investors behind it. Lumping all of that together and saying 2% holds 95% is a distorted way of counting. The real issue is control over the Bitcoin network. That does not depend on how many coins anyone holds. It depends on who runs the nodes, who mines the coin, who decides on protocol upgrades. Across all three dimensions, Bitcoin remains decentralized. There are tens of thousands of nodes operating around the world. No one can unilaterally change the rules of the game. As for Jane Street, that was a short-term price impact event. Every financial market has moments where large players trigger sharp declines. But Jane Street cannot print Bitcoin, cannot alter the ledger, cannot change the fixed supply of 21 million coins. They can only affect price in the short term. The defense rests. Prosecution responds. Ladies and gentlemen, what promise was Bitcoin sold on? Money that no one can manipulate, money that no one controls. Ordinary people did not care about the distinction between ownership concentration and network control concentration. They understood one thing: Bitcoin is fair, no one can rig the price, no whale can sink the market. And what is the reality? Jane Street may have helped trigger a $40 billion collapse. BlackRock can buy or sell tens of thousands of Bitcoin and create massive price swings. One tweet from Elon Musk sends Bitcoin jumping 10%. Is that money no one can manipulate? As for the defense's point that 2% of addresses include exchanges, yes, but that makes the story worse, not better. If an exchange like Binance is holding Bitcoin for millions of people, then Binance becomes a bank. A crypto bank. And Bitcoin has circled back to exactly the model Satoshi wanted to eliminate: trust in an intermediary. Only this intermediary is less regulated than a traditional bank. The prosecution rests. Defense responds. Ladies and gentlemen, ownership concentration is a feature of every valuable asset during its accumulation phase. Gold is concentrated too. Central banks hold the majority of the world's gold. The dollar is concentrated too. A small group of ultra-wealthy individuals hold the majority of dollars. No one calls gold or the dollar a scam because of that. Bitcoin is in an early accumulation phase. Concentrated ownership today does not mean it stays concentrated forever. The defense rests. Prosecution. Ladies and gentlemen, gold and the dollar were never marketed as Decentralized, fair, no one in control. Gold never claimed to be a revolution. The dollar never claimed to be financial liberation. Bitcoin did. Bitcoin was sold to the world on exactly that promise. And people bought Bitcoin because they believed in that promise. But set aside ownership concentration and false decentralization for now, none of that has yet answered the biggest question: where does Bitcoin's value actually come from? And that brings us to the final charge, and the heaviest one. Charge 5. Bitcoin operates on the greater fool theory. Prosecution. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most serious charge, and also the one that, after years of reflection, troubled me the most personally. Let me begin with a classic economic concept, the greater fool theory. The premise is straightforward. The price of an asset does not need to be justified by its intrinsic value, as long as there is a greater fool willing to buy it at a higher price. In other words, you buy not because the asset is actually worth that much. You buy because you believe someone else will buy it from you at a higher price. And that person buys because they believe there will be yet another buyer. The cycle continues as long as there is always someone next in line. The day there is no one next in line, the entire system collapses. Now, let me map Bitcoin onto this theory. Evidence 1. Bitcoin generates no cash flow. Stocks have dividends, with corporate earnings standing behind them. Bonds have interest. Real estate has rental income. Gold generates no cash flow either, but it has industrial applications, use in jewelry, and thousands of years of cultural accumulation. Bitcoin has no dividends, no interest, no rental income, no industrial applications, no cultural history. Bitcoin only has a price when someone is willing to pay that price. Evidence 2. The narrative keeps changing. Follow the evolution of the stories told about Bitcoin. From 2009 to 2013, Bitcoin was billed as peer-to-peer electronic cash, replacing banks. That did not happen. From 2013 to 2017, it was billed as the money of the future. You will be able to buy coffee with it everywhere. That did not happen. From 2017 to 2020, it was billed as a hedge against inflation. Then in 2022, as US inflation surged, Bitcoin fell 75%. That did not happen. In the current phase, it is billed as digital gold, a store of value. And as I demonstrated in Charge 3, that does not hold up either. Each time the technology fails to deliver on the old promise, the story gets rewritten. This is not the behavior of an asset with real value. This is the behavior of something constantly searching for new reasons to maintain belief, to keep pulling new buyers into the cycle. Evidence 3. The characteristic loop of the greater fool. Look at how Bitcoin has operated over the past decade. Plus, a narrative builds, belief leads to belief, creates demand, leads to demand, pushes up the price. Leads to rising prices, generate a new narrative, leads to the new narrative, draws in. More new buyers leads to new buyers, push prices higher still. No product, no revenue. Nothing of substance actually being created between those cycles. Only self-sustaining belief and a continuous stream of new entrants pouring in. Ladies and gentlemen, when an asset has no intrinsic value, generates no cash flow, has no widespread practical application, and its price is sustained purely by the inflow of new buyers. That is a precise description of the greater fool theory. And the day the inflow of new buyers stops, the entire system will collapse. This is not fraud in the legal sense. No one is running off with the money, no one is promising returns and then defaulting. But in terms of economic mechanism, in terms of the way the price is being sustained, Bitcoin operates on exactly the model economists have warned about for centuries as extraordinarily dangerous. The prosecution rests. Defense. Ladies and gentlemen, this charge sounds compelling, but it can be applied to nearly every asset human beings currently hold. Gold. More than 90% of the world's gold is hoarded, not used for industry. Gold's price is determined by the collective belief that gold stores value. The dollar. Since leaving the gold standard in 1971, the dollar has not been backed by any real asset. The dollar's value comes from collective belief that everyone else will accept it. The prosecution is applying a standard that exists solely for Bitcoin. Every asset has an element of collective belief. The distinction is not whether belief is present, it is whether that belief has a foundation. And Bitcoin has a foundation. A fixed supply of 21 million coins, a global network no nation controls, and growing institutional acceptance. Furthermore, Bitcoin is not a fraud. Fraud is when someone deliberately seizes another person's assets. In Bitcoin, the source code is open. Anyone can examine it. There is no Sam Bankman-Fried, no Do Kwon, no one running off with everyone's money. Bitcoin may fail, but if it does, that is a technology failure, not a fraud. The defense rests. Prosecution responds, "Ladies and gentlemen, the defense just said, fraud is when someone deliberately seizes another person's assets. Correct, by the legal definition. No argument there. But please recall the original charge in this trial. A sophisticated global-scale scheme. The word sophisticated is what matters. Because the sophistication lies in this, there does not need to be a specific mastermind, there does not need to be someone running away with the money, and yet a system can still cause millions of people to lose money in a systematic way. I am not charging any individual, I am charging a mechanism. A mechanism in which the story gets continuously rewritten to pull new people in which prices are driven up by the inflow of new buyers, in which early buyers sell to late buyers at a premium. And when the flow of new entrants runs dry, the last buyers lose everything. Is that fraud in the legal sense? No. Is it a system in which the outcome for the last buyer is identical to the outcome of victims in a fraud? Yes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the part that truly warrants concern. The prosecution rests. This trial closes here. There is no need for me to deliver a verdict. All 5 charges have been fully presented, and honestly, not one of them did I find the defense able to fully answer. What I want everyone to take away from this video is not, Bitcoin is a scam, stay far away from it. And not, Bitcoin is the future, go put your money in. What I want is for you to see it for what it actually is. Participate with control if you choose to participate at all. And finally, if you found this video useful, please subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.